Now, for his analysis on Australia's first recession in close to almost 30 years, the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, joins me now from Sydney. Paul, the message from the government today is that this was unavoidable and could have been a lot worse. Let's take a listen.
We chose our own path and put in place $314 billion worth of support for Australians to build a bridge to the other side of this crisis. Our strong economic position going into this crisis has given us the financial firepower to respond. Without the Morrison government's economic support, 700,000 more jobs would have been lost and the unemployment rate 5 percentage points higher than it is today.
The opposition, Paul, want to make this recession hang around the government's neck, a bit like Keating's recession dogged Labor for much of the Howard years. But, of course, it comes from a pandemic, not government policy. Do you think they'll succeed?
Well, I think most of the public will understand that the recession has been caused by the pandemic. But the big challenge now, of course, is what happens next? The management of the recovery, how bad things get, and we know that the Reserve Bank predicts that unemployment will go to 10% and will still be at 7% in 2 years' time. So this will be the most important national test Australians as a people and Australian governments have faced since World War II. The magnitude of the downturn in the June quarter at 7% contraction is the worst contraction since the Great Depression. So no one should have any doubt about the magnitude of the test. And the question will be, both now and in the budget and in the months beyond the budget, how successful Australia is in terms of getting ourselves on a path to recovery, in terms of both beating the pandemic, containing the pandemic, and then above all, in terms of managing an economic recovery, which will take a few years.
Right, but in the absence of a vaccine, all the usual economic levers, in terms of stimulus, aren't necessarily an option. I made the point at the top of the show, it's not government spending that gets you out of this sort of trouble. It's small business. It's the private sector getting back on their feet. Now, given 40% of the workforce right now are on some sort of government welfare, I suspect the brutal reality of the recession is not biting wage earners. Small business, yes, but wage earners not so much. Do you think we understand the sort of trouble we're in?
Well, that's a critical question, and I think to a significant extent we haven't yet felt the real magnitude of the trouble we're in. As the Treasurer just said, if it hadn't been for government fiscal support, unemployment levels would be 700,000 higher. And so what we're going to see in coming months as the recovery strategy is put in place will be strong ongoing government spending, but a wind back of its magnitude in terms of JobKeeper and JobSeeker. We will see a degree of economic reform to try and improve productivity, and we'll see an enormous emphasis on job creation across the board. The entire focus of all government activity, and that's why there'll be a lot of investment incentives for the corporate sector, will be that focus on job creation. So I think the political contest will end up being who's got the most credible agenda in terms of economic recovery.
So Scott Morrison, former Treasurer, now Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, they can't be blamed for this recession given the global circumstances of COVID and the contraction's far greater, by quantum numbers in terms of where we were at the GFC. The real test, particularly for the Treasurer, will come. How does he get us out? How's the plan look? What does the plan look like? How shallow is it, or how deep is this recession? How long does it go on for? What are you hearing in terms of the push in October's budget?
Okay, I think there are two immediate tests here, Peter. The first one will be the National Cabinet meeting on Friday. The Prime Minister's made it clear that he wants action off the back of these numbers. This is really important. We had the national accounts today. So what will happen on Friday when the National Cabinet meets? it is imperative that all the leaders in that national cabinet meeting show they understand the magnitude of the national challenge. Now, it's by no means clear this is the case, and we may well see very significant splits in the national cabinet. The Prime Minister's indicated that he wants a new commitment to a recovery strategy, which is what we had last May before it fell apart because of the Victorian second wave. The second test will be with the budget. And essentially what we'll see with the budget will be strong ongoing spending, significant incentives for the corporate sector to create more jobs, and an agenda of sorts for economic reform to boost jobs and productivity.
I wish we'd stop calling it a national cabinet, because one of the key principles of cabinet is cabinet solidarity, that, you know, you might win the argument in the room, but if the majority go one way, you're with the majority, and that's certainly not been the circumstance. I want to go to something you wrote today in The Australian. You wrote obviously about this deepening threat to liberal democracy in the United States and, you know, warring pledges made by President Donald Trump and the Democratic nominee Joe Biden. There are some stark and obvious differences in their campaign methods. You wrote, with Trump renewing his pledge to make America great again and Biden's pledges to restore the soul of America from the darkness and inequality of racism. This is where we see the battle lines. And I started at the top of the show, you know, this Massachusetts primary, 74-year-old Ed Markey, now he's on the hard left, beating out Joe Kennedy. It shows you, doesn't it, what it says to me, you know, Biden is a front of the old, more generous left, and behind him is the AOCs, the Markeys, you know, and a much harder left to contend with. And if it's a law and order campaign, where does this go?
Well, look, I think the most alarming thing to me about what's happening in America at the moment is that we always see fundamental divisions in any presidential election, but this seems to be far deeper. I think we've got a really fundamental split here about the direction of the United States and almost the nature of what sort of country America is. And if you look at the language used by Joe Biden and Donald Trump, you can see this. Both of them identify this as an absolute watershed election in terms of the future of the country and what the country stands for. And I think one of the great problems is, what will this election resolve? And I think a great concern is that the divisions which are plaguing the United States will endure beyond the election. Now, in terms of the two candidates, Biden's problem is that he's pledging to unite the country, but the difficulty is that he's running a Democratic Party which has gone significantly to the left since President Obama was in office. And so wide sections of the Democratic Party have got an extreme radical left-wing agenda. And that is a problem for Biden, because to a certain extent he's trying to disguise that. The problem for Trump, of course, is that he's divided the country. The entire Trump presidency has been based on dividing the country, hopefully, as far as Trump's concerned, getting a majority his way. I think one of Trump's problems is, if only he'd govern as president with some degree of discipline and a lack of chaos, then he'd be in a far better position than what he's in now. But there's no doubt that Trump, while I think he's a very bad governor, is a very dangerous campaigner. He can identify the weakness in the Democrats. He's going to run on law and order big time, and that, I think, is going to be a problem for Biden.
And look, they're giving him plenty of ammo. I mean, they're giving him plenty of circumstances and imagery on the news most night, and I think people are feeling very vulnerable, and he's playing into all of that. It'll be a very fascinating campaign. Paul Kelly, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.